Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I'd like to take some time to talk about the study of reading for young children, because I think parents err in um, underestimating the difficulty of reading and how reading actually works, what reading actually is, and this leads to a lot of confusion and stress in early education for children. Um, I was having a chat this afternoon with a parent who is expressing some concern about a child's reading ability, and as we chatted, a number of important issues came up in the discussion, and I thought it would be good for me to make a video and expand on some of those issues while they're fresh in my mind, and I have a sense of the trouble that parents have when it comes to the study of reading. The main problem with the study of reading is that in modern schools, modern textbooks, reading is often separated from grammar and turned into a subject that stands on its own. And really, reading can't be understood outside of the context of grammar. We try to get started with reading because we'd like our little ones to read, but really it doesn't work like that. It's not that simple. And I'd like to explain that a little bit. In grammar, we learn the art of language. We study language, and language consists of ideas and words. And in grammar, we learn that we observe things through the senses. We perceive them through the senses, or we think of them without perception. We're conscious of them. And our mind forms mental images of things that we are conscious of. And so in our minds, we have these mental images, which we call ideas or notions or conceptions. And we have these ideas within ourselves, within our own minds, and we communicate them. We share them in different ways, or we try to share them. We try to communicate them in different ways. A young child may try to share an idea by drawing a picture. But normally, we try to share our ideas through words. And what words are symbols that are used to share ideas. Words are symbols that we use to share, to represent and share the ideas that we possess in our minds. The ideas that we have are shared by spoken words, and this is very important. The ideas that we have are shared by spoken words, and in grammar we learn that spoken words are symbols of ideas. When we're not able to communicate through spoken words, then we use written words. Written words are symbols of spoken words. Written words are not symbols of ideas. We don't seek to signify an idea with a written word. The ideas are signified by spoken words. And when we write, to communicate through writing, to share ideas in writing, our written words are symbols of the spoken words, not of the ideas themselves. And so there's an order in language that we have to pay attention to. There are objects outside of us that we perceive, things that we're conscious of, and we have ideas of these things. We then form symbols or these symbols are formed by human beings, we often just learn what the symbols are. We don't make them up. We learn what the symbols are of ideas, and these are spoken words, and then we seek to share spoken words by means of written words. And when we share ideas through written words and send a letter or give a book or even a sheet of paper or an email or whatever else, a text message, someone else receives that message with written words. And reading is the process by which they understand what spoken words are represented in those written words and what ideas are represented by those spoken words. And so we see there's an order and a process. And reading is just one piece of that process. Now, what most parents desire, and this is sort of a parental fantasy, what most parents desire is for their children to sit in a chair with a book and read and quietly learn. We have a fantasy that children can learn through reading. And this is really not realistic. It's impossible to learn through reading because written words are symbols of spoken words. And when a child looks at a book or a sheet of paper or an email or anything else, when they see written words, they think of what spoken words are represented there in writing. And that's what it means to read. To read is to think of what spoken words are represented by the words that are written. Now, the problem for young children is that their ideas are limited by their experience. They don't have many ideas. Their ideas are simple, they're crude, they're vague, and their spoken words are very limited. The words that they know are very limited. Just think, if you have a 5-year-old child, how many words do you think the child actually knows? How many spoken words do you think the child actually knows? It's really not that many. And so when a child is asked to read, or when a parent or a teacher attempts to teach a child to read, the child has to look at written words and identify the spoken word that's represented by the written word. And this is very difficult, not because the child can't look at letters and name letters and identify the different sounds that a letter can represent, but because the words are not simply collections of spoken sounds. They're actually symbols of written words. And we can see examples of this in English where we have lots of confusion in language. If we think of the words cough, C-O-U-G-H, rough, R-O-U-G-H, dough, D-O-U-G-H, and so on. There's no way for a child to rightly read those words unless he knows the spoken words and can make a good guess of what the spoken word is that's represented by the written word. There's no way for any phonics rule to lead a child to rightly read those words. And this is true of many words in any language. I'm 47 years old and I consider myself to be quite literate and well educated. And if I pick up a book or an article or any kind of paper and read about a subject that I've never studied before and find vocabulary in that reading that I've never encountered before, I'll often not know how to read those words. I don't know how to read those words. And the reason why is not because I don't know phonics, not because I don't understand letters, not because I don't understand how letters signify sounds or anything like that. It's because the words are symbols of spoken words that I simply am not familiar with. And I'm not able to read those words. We'll often find children who spend a lot of time reading books will know words that they've seen in writing, but they don't know how to pronounce them because they've never heard them before in spoken words. They've never used them in speech. They've never talked about or heard about those ideas. And so there's no easy way to learn to read. There's no easy way. Reading is a lifelong study. It's a lifelong activity. Anytime we encounter a word that we've never heard before, we're going to have a difficult time figuring out how to read that word. And it doesn't matter whether we're a 5-year-old in a kindergarten class or a 47-year-old full-time schoolmaster. Reading always requires study. We always have to learn what spoken word is signified by a certain written word. And so if you have a young child and you're teaching that child the basics of phonics, you're teaching letters and sounds, and you're practicing reading syllables and learning sight words, as we do in our English reading course, you shouldn't be surprised if you ask the child to take up another book on a different topic and see the child struggle because he doesn't recognize the spoken words that those written words represent. That's the challenge of reading. And it just takes time and experience. It takes time and experience. And what I recommend to parents, what I recommended to the mother I spoke with today is to have the child learn to read by reading written texts that are full of familiar words. A great place to start, a place where my children have learned to read has been through daily prayers or the missal or a hymnal, where there are prayers especially, like the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, the Apostles' Creed, and so on, where we recite the words all the time and the children memorize the words. Those are the best texts to use to learn to read because the words are familiar. Hymns, where we sing hymns together as a family and the child becomes familiar with the words that are sung, those texts are easy for the children to read because they can identify the spoken words that the written words represent. But if you give a child a text that the child has never heard read before, that contains words that the child has never heard before, the child's going to struggle, whether that child is 5 years old or 15 years old or 35 years old. It's difficult to read words that we've never heard before, that we're not familiar with. So parents shouldn't let that concern them. Reading develops with experience, not just experience with reading, but experience with conversation and discussion, building a spoken vocabulary that then becomes familiar in writing. Also, by writing, children want to share a certain spoken word, and they have to learn how to write it. And as they learn to write spoken words in writing, they also learn how to read and recognize those words when they see them as they read. And so I just want to make sure parents understand that the work of reading is not some simple operation that children can practice after they've learned a few rules. And I'd like to give a little an example of one way that I learned this on a different subject. When I was a teenager, I loved to draw. I was very artistic and I liked to draw, but what I loved most of all, what I was really interested in was the art of lettering, where artists, write with all different kinds of handwriting and scripts, whether it's calligraphy or some kind of flowing cursive or block letters, all different kinds of letters. I found the work of lettering to really be fascinating. And what I thought as I started to try to learn this art of lettering, I thought that the great letterers, I thought that they simply memorized methods, how to hold a pen, the angle at which to hold a pen, how to hold their hands or their arms, or what movements to make. I thought that there would be some kind of mechanical art of lettering. And to some degree there is. But as I had the opportunity to observe master letterers actually practicing the art, what I saw was that they actually didn't practice some mechanical method. The master letterers that were the most talented, that did the most beautiful work, they simply drew and painted letters. They thought in their minds of what they wanted the script or the letters to look like, and then they simply made that happen on the paper or on the signs or whatever else they did. There wasn't a simple mechanical procedure to follow, but there was an art to it. It took imagination. It took real skill to be able to form any kind of line, a thick line, a thin line, a curved line, a straight line. It was far more complex than I realized that it was. The letterers didn't simply memorize strokes and different mechanical techniques. The letterers imagined what they wanted the lettering to look like, and then they painted or drew that, and they made it to look the way they wanted it to look. It was much more complex and artistic than I originally thought. And this is what reading is like. Reading is not some simple mechanical operation. We can't simply put the rules into the mind of a child and then have the child just analyze and decode and read like a machine. If you ever listen to machine text-to-speech programs, you'll hear how artificial and often inaccurate the reading can be. If you look at videos where subtitles are produced automatically, you'll see how many errors there are because language simply doesn't work like that. Language doesn't work like that. It's not mechanical. It's not some simple robotic operation that requires a few lines of programming to be able to carry out. There's a lot of reasoning and thinking and comparing and experience that's required before we can learn to accurately read. And this is what parents often get frustrated with their children, is that they want to go through a few phonics lessons and then have the children start reading. And by reading, they mean the child can take any book and read all the words just relying on a few phonics rules. And that's just not what written language actually is. That's not how reading works. And so parents have to learn to be patient. They have to learn to judge their children's reading ability by the children's ability to read written words that represent spoken words that they're familiar with. And that's why, as I said, prayers, common prayers, are a great source for reading lessons. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's English reading course, we use the Gospel of John, and we always start with the Gospel of John, and it should be familiar to children, and that's why we do that. But basic prayers are a great source of reading text. Hymns, things that the child has already heard spoken, should be the material that's used to teach reading, because even in adult life, we very rarely ever read something that we're not already familiar with. Very, very rarely. And when we do find ourselves reading something or reading words that we're not familiar with as spoken words, we struggle to read them, even as well-educated adults. And so we see that same struggle in our children, and we can just think, if it's difficult sometimes for us to read unfamiliar material, how much more difficult will it be for children? So keep that in mind. Stick to familiar texts, texts that contain words children have heard before and already know. And if you'd like to read a new text, what I recommend is that the parent read the text aloud to the child. Don't let the child look at the words, but just have the child listen to the reading, short passages of readings. Have the child listen. Have the child think of the spoken words that they hear. And then after they're familiar with all of the spoken words, then give them the opportunity to read. Because again, that's what reading is. Reading is the reading of spoken words in written symbols. And so if you'd like to read something new and introduce a child to new words, what I recommend is that you read the text aloud first, so the child becomes familiar with all the spoken words that are contained in the reading, and then help the child to recognize those spoken words in their written form. That's really what reading is. So don't put too much pressure on a child's ability to read based on phonics rules alone. Don't judge the quality of a reading program based on whether or not a child can read a word he's not familiar with as a spoken word simply by following the rules learned in a reading lesson. That's not how reading works. Don't disconnect. Don't separate reading from the rest of the art of grammar. Remember that we start with observation and ideas, and then we signify ideas with spoken words, and then we signify spoken words with written words. You have to keep all of that together. That's what we learn in grammar. Reading is just one part of grammar. Don't try to separate it. And another thing that I discuss with the parent is to realize that the ability to take a general rule and apply it to a specific example is a part of the faculty of reasoning. And when we're dealing with young children, we're dealing with children who are just entering into the age of reason, which, we're told normally comes in around age 7 or so. So if you're dealing with a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, those kids are not even to the age of reason yet. And you may be asking them to perform mental operations that are really just developing in them at that time of their lives. And so all of these things have to be kept in mind as you work with young children. Don't get stressed out. Don't think that more is better, more work, more practice. Don't make the kids miserable. Don't jump to unfounded conclusions that the child has some kind of learning disability or something because he's not reading at age 5 or he's not moving along as well as you would like him to. Nature, what I always tell parents, nature doesn't care about artificial school standards. Nature doesn't care what is called normal for a kindergarten student or a first. Nature doesn't care. Every child is going to be different. I almost said difficult, but it's really not difficult. Every child is going to be different. But if we zoom out and look at the child's life in the big picture, there's really not that much difference. It's just a matter of time when different abilities emerge, and we'll see that there's a variety between the children, but there are general phases of their development and growth that are normal, and we have to learn to be patient and be a little flexible. Not think that this should be like a computer program or some kind of mechanical activity. So parents need to relax and not jump to ridiculous conclusions because a child is learning to read later. I had one daughter of mine who read when she was 3 years old, was reading, could sit down and read books when she was 3 years old. I had another daughter who really didn't begin to read well until she was 10 years old. Same family, same methods, same mother teaching both of them, two completely different rates of development and times of development, and yet by teenage years they're all fine. These differences all work themselves out and everything's fine. So try not to make too much of any variety in the times at which children become comfortable in reading and what you're going to learn with experience. This is one reason why homeschooling is difficult. Often parents get involved in homeschooling and they don't have experience dealing with different children. They don't know these things as an experienced school teacher would. But you'll see that a child will just be clueless when it comes to reading for a long time possibly. And then all of a sudden one day, it's as if the light just goes on. And all of a sudden, syllables and words make sense to the child. And my wife refers to this as the light going on. And we know when we're teaching a child to read and the child's struggling and it seems like he's not doing well, we know it's just a matter of time. And one day, out of nowhere, boom, everything comes together and the child quickly begins to read, and it's hard to even remember that there were struggles before. So understand why reading is difficult. Understand why reading can't be separated from the other parts of grammar. Understand why children will develop at different paces. Understand why children will have difficulty reading certain words when they're not familiar with the spoken words. Understand what texts are appropriate to use to teach your children to read, and understand also how you can help the children learn to read by reading things aloud to them beforehand, making them familiar with all the spoken words, and then giving them the opportunity to try and identify the spoken words represented by the words in the text. That's what reading is. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions about teaching reading and working with the little ones, I have some knowledge of this simply because I'm a grammarian, not that I'm some kind of specialized reading teacher. My wife is more of the expert reading teacher, but really it's simply a part of grammar. And when parents learn to think of everything through the lens of classical grammar and the different parts of grammar, they can understand what's going on when a child is learning to read, what skills need to develop, what prerequisites there are for a child to learn to read, and it helps parents to manage this work and not overreact when things don't go well. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions about teaching children reading, feel free to get in touch with us. You can always email us, get in touch on live chat on our website, or even call us. All of our contact information is available on the Academy website at classicalliberalarts.com. So don't get discouraged, don't get worried, don't get frustrated, don't make any decisions that are unnecessary. You might just need to relax. You might be using the wrong kind of texts. You might be expecting progress too soon, and in most cases, the children are going to learn to read. It's just a matter of time. There are only so many lessons we can teach them to help them until that light goes on and they begin reading. So I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.